What would be said of a generation of Americans and Canadians who found a way to explore the stars, but allowed their lakes and forests and streams to languish and die? There are many examples of corporate success stories today on the issue of adapting to climate change, and it's vital because there can be no policy on the environment without the implication and the leadership of the private sector. And so dozens of global corporations have met and exceeded emissions reductions targets and met them years ahead of schedule. In most instances, emissions reductions increase profitability. Not only is it the right thing to do, it's good business, and it's good for business. Consumers have a choice. They can vote with their wallets to reward responsible corporations for sustainable development. They can buy shares in environmentally responsible companies, either as individual or group investors, and so they should. And so, Mr. Chairman and friends, in my judgment, there are three elements to Canada playing an important role on the environment. First, leading by example, not by slogan, claiming the high ground. Second, engaging the Americans at the highest level of government. And this is something that probably only the Prime Minister of Canada can do to the extent desirable. And third, involving industry in our solutions. Let me illustrate with the example of acid rain, which I raised, as was mentioned, with President Reagan when I went to Washington in 1984, just before the '84 election when I was leader of the opposition. In March of '85 at the Shamrock Summit in Quebec City, President Reagan agreed to the appointment of special envoys, Drew Lewis and Bill Davis, who reported directly to us. That was another step in the process. Frank Carlucci, President Reagan's national security advisor and subsequently his Secretary of Defense, describes how testy President Reagan became when his officials continued to stall and stymie my government on issues ranging from acid rain to Arctic sovereignty to free trade. According to a recent account published by Professor Jeffrey L. Chidester, Research Director for Presidential and Special Projects at the University of Virginia, before entering 24 Sussex and having met with me at the House of Commons and had this debate on those subjects, and now I'm going to quote from Carlucci's account to the university. Reagan took Carlucci aside and said, quote, "I think we should do something for Brian." Carlucci said, "Mr. President, we're doing well holding our positions on acid rain, the free trade agreement, and the Northwest Passage." "Oh, no," said Reagan. "We ought to do something." After lunch, Carlucci continued to push for the American position. Carlucci said, "I said to the President, no, we're holding to our positions. These are well-established American positions." Carlucci then said, "It was the only time I ever saw Ronald Reagan lose his temper. He turned to me and he said, 'You do it.'" Carlucci went right from the meeting and grabbed Derek Burney, Mulroney's chief of staff, and asked, "Derek, would you reiterate your positions on acid rain, trade, and the Northwest Passage?" When Burney asked why, Carlucci said, "Because they're our positions now." Immediately after that exchange, President Reagan sat with his cabinet officials and senior advisors behind closed doors in the living room at 24 Sussex and amended his speech to Parliament, slated for later that afternoon. He wrote that, quote, he had agreed to consider a bilateral agreement with Canada over acid rain and added a promise, quote, to inject new impetus into talks regarding recognition of Canadian sovereignty over the Arctic. Professor Chidester concluded, quote, personal diplomacy was the only way to break the bureaucratic inertia on these issues, unquote. Let me tell you clearly, anyone who fails to appreciate that there is an important connection between good personal relationships among leaders and success in foreign policy understands absolutely nothing about either. In 1991, we signed the Acid Rain Accord with the first President Bush. Both President Reagan, and this is on the public record, both President Reagan and President Bush rejected the advice of their officials on acid rain because of the special relationship between the United States and Canada and the personal rapport between the President and the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Harper is off to a very good start in managing this challenging and sensitive file. The golden rule of Canada-US relations is very simple, and the Prime Minister's put it very well. We can disagree without being disagreeable. For as the Prime Minister has also said, the Americans are very important to us. We know they are, notwithstanding the differences, our best ally, our closest neighbor, and our biggest customer. And I can also tell you, having had to deal with these matters on a personal basis for almost a decade, there is a rule of global politics that Canada's influence in the world is measured to a significant degree by the extent to which we are perceived as having real influence in Washington. For the past decade and more, as many experts have observed, Canada, for some reason, has allowed that clout to erode. Prime Minister Harper intends to begin anew. As he has already demonstrated, Ottawa doesn't have to go along with Washington in order to get along with the United States of America. The Americans are smart. They know exactly what a Canadian Prime Minister has to do, and they want to accommodate someone who is reasonable and thoughtful in his approach and views the Americans as friends, and friends give other friends the benefit of the doubt, and that's what happened when I was there, and I hope that'll happen again. Which brings me to the main point I want to leave with you. Before I do, one of the former ambassadors, Jim Blanchard, is here, along with David, the present American ambassador. Former governor of Michigan. I once told the ambassador and governor that there hadn't been our relationship was so good that and he was the governor of Michigan, there hadn't been a shot fired across the border in 177 years. And when the last time it happened, a couple of Irishmen got out of hand. But I told them that in that war, we captured Detroit, and we gave it back. So who says Canadians are not nice?